of Greater Kane County Wild Ones. We're so happy you joined us tonight. This is going to be a wonderful meeting. For those of you who don't, excuse me, my cat. For those of you who don't know Wild Ones, we are totally dedicated to native plants and native landscaping, both restoring and maintaining. We're a chapter of wildones.org out of Wisconsin. We're our local chapter. We also, I would invite you, if you haven't, to go to our own website, which is startinyouryard.com, all lowercase. And it is the initiative of our chapter. And there are wonderful things for you to peruse in there. There are all of these presentations that we gave last year, all about native plants and creating native plants in your own yard. And we're partnering with Gale Borden Library last year to do that. And we are thrilled that we are going to be partnering with the Gale Borden Library next year to bring you even more presentations. So I certainly invite you to join us, come to our meetings. We'll certainly have another plant sale in the spring, hopefully a real one this year. So I'm going to now turn it over to Luann Lewandowski, who is one of our program chairs, and she's going to tell you about some of our upcoming presentations. So thank you all for coming.
Hey, thanks, Kim. We have some programs coming up that you're not going to want to miss. As usual, we're skipping November for you to prepare for the holidays and for Thanksgiving with your family. But next, we have a holiday party, December 5th at Johnson's Mound. This will include food, a walk, a bonfire, plus we're going to have access to the cabin and facilities. All of our members are invited. Next will be our January 2022 program, probably Zoom, but this will be our movie and popcorn as usual. And to start the year, we're going to view Fantastic Fungi on January 27th, Thursday. The movie got 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. And I read a funny review that said it's a thought-provoking film that detracts from itself by idolizing its main character. Ha ha. And that there are many amazing fungal graphics. Our good friend Mary Alice Masonic highly recommends it. And we have other events planned and some confirmations that are still in the works. Hey, for tonight, we've asked Ed Collins if he'd take questions after the program, and he will. So please put any questions you have in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to go through the question box with him after his program. Now, I'd like to introduce our good friend and founding member of Wild Ones, June Keebler.
Thanks, Luann. Well, Ed Collins, our very special guest speaker this evening, has been employed by the McHenry County Conservation District since 1986. That's a long time, Ed. In the Land Preservation and Natural Resources Management Division, where he is currently serving as their director. Ed holds a master's degree from Northeastern Illinois University in Geography and Environmental Studies, and has been involved in a number of interesting, critical, and leading edge projects over the years. A good example is Ed's leadership in the remeandering of the Nippersink Creek. The project enhanced not only the health of the creek, but the watershed itself and our own Fox River. Ed's continued assistance in the establishment of the Hackmatack National Wildlife Refuge has proven invaluable. And he also was instrumental in creating the first comprehensive study of oak loss in McHenry County for the years from 1837 to 2012. If you've ever had the opportunity or the privilege of taking a walking tour with Ed, you quickly learn that Ed, besides speaking English, speaks a language that few of us can hear. Ed speaks and hears the language of the land. By listening to the land, he is able to connect to the spirit of the land. He can perceive and articulate the needs of the land. He knows the land's capabilities and its limitations. He knows its suffering and its sadness. And he knows firsthand the happiness of the land. Ed, welcome. Thank you. Take it away.
Thank you, June. Those are some very kind words. And thank the group for allowing me to speak on behalf of the Oaks this evening. Now, I know many of you have either read or you're planning to read Doug Tallamy's excellent book, The Nature of Oaks. And I'll be touching on a few of the same personality traits, or as I call them, the quirks of the genus Quercus tonight, but not nearly as in-depth as in Doug's book. So I highly recommend it to anyone who's not had the chance to enjoy the read. It's full of more detailed information on oak topics of all types. So I'd like to begin our evening by sharing a story with you. Let me get my program up and running. So 35 years ago, in the midst of a March thaw, a young man reported for the first day of work at a new job. It was the dream job, the one he had waited for his entire life. And the pinnacle of years of wishing and reverie, it was a job conserving the land. And he barely slept the night before in anticipation and skipped breakfast in the desire to be on time for that first day. As with all new jobs, as many of us know, there were the perfunctory introductions and the brief tour of things and a pile of forms to sign. And then finally, the first assignment, grading a gravel road just installed the year before to service a new nature center. Well, by noon, that young man had managed to bury the tractor up to the back axle twice in the thawing shoulder of the road, and the hitch pin had sheared repeatedly, and the job that should have taken an hour remained unfinished. And when his new supervisor showed up at lunchtime, there was really no mistaking the look of disdain at the rutted road shoulder and the equally rutted looking new Ranger. The afternoon went from bad to worse, and by quitting time, what should have been the long anticipated perfect first day had disintegrated into a series of mistakes and misfortunes and misjudgments. So that young man decided that a walk might steady his mind before beginning the long drive home to a wife and a new child that were waiting to hear every detail of that first perfect day. So a mile down the trail that he took, there was a flat glacial erratic rock, and it rested on the edge of a former hayfield, probably exactly where a team of draft horses had dropped it decades before when the land first felt the iron of the plow. And the young man stopped to rest for a moment before heading back. The disastrous events of the day played in a continuous loop, and he wondered if maybe all of his conservation dreams were just that, only dreams. And as those thoughts swirled one upon another, a blue jay swooped down off of a nearby tree and began picking his way along the piles of rocks that marked the once upon a time edge of that old hayfield. And the bird stopped every few minutes, every few seconds, and cocked his head as if he was listening for something. And finally, he paused in front of a pile of boulders and seemed to listen even harder. And out of one of those rocky crevices, he pulled forth an acorn. And pleased with himself, the bird was in flight in an instant. And as that jay took flight, the young man felt the rest of the fence line snap into view, as if someone had removed a blindfold from his face and unveiled the world for the first time. And all along the rocky edge, oaks of various sizes grew from tiny gaps between the stones. So curious, he walked closer to discover that in almost every case, they had sprouted from the most inhospitable place possible for a tree to start life. Some random event, some jay that had misjudged the depth of a rock crevice, or a spring melt that had filled that crevice with enough water to support a sprouting nut. Maybe a peculiar angle of the sun that had allowed enough light to unbend that stem upwards until it could stand on its own. They had all seemed to conspire to bring oaks to a forgotten fence line in a tiny park somewhere in a rural Illinois county. And it occurred to the young man that maybe everything didn't have to be perfect in the beginning for something truly important to grow. Perhaps that might even be the way nature intended it to be, for oaks and for people to grow in their own time and in their own way. And as those thoughts rose like the snow fog that was beginning to unfurl in the evening air, that jay returned. He reappeared not more than a dozen feet from him and carefully dropped another acorn into the rocks. And as he did, a breeze flowed out of the east and shook the leaves on those small fence row oaks, as if to say, "Do you understand now?" That day was the moment I first became aware that oaks possessed an intelligence. The first day I heard the land speak directly to my soul, and it would not be the last. I've never stopped listening to the land since that long ago March day, when an older world first knocked on the door of my spiritual subconscious. The land's taught me that the natural world is full of conversations. Some are idle chit chat, the kind that flows from a planet that's been alive for nearly 2 billion years, and others are quite profound. Some entail great wisdom, and some are simply joyous mirth. And they're born of the senses and the emotions that all species possess. So in our time together this evening, I'd like to share with you some of the insight that the land, and especially oaks, have been kind enough to impart to me these many years, and why I feel that we stand poised on one of the most remarkable transformations to human culture that has ever occurred, and why, of all the diverse partnerships we form in the course of our work, the relationship that binds us to place is the most important we will ever forge. So I alluded a little bit earlier that oaks possess an intelligence, and I remain firmly convinced of that fact. But what exactly does that mean? So I thought maybe a good beginning would be to explore that ecological intelligence by assessing oaks broadly as a group, how they've come to be a cornerstone of our local ecosystems in Northern Illinois, and how widening our view to understand our woods, not just as individual species, but as a larger ecosystem, can allow us to see both the forest and the trees at the same time. Let me start with a little bit about oak history. Oaks have very ancient beginnings, and they stretch backward to the end of the age of the dinosaurs, some 65 million years ago. On that last day, a dinosaur must have looked up into the sky and realized it wasn't going to be a great week. A piece of wayward asteroid impacted our planet in the Gulf of Mexico, and it hit the Earth like a chip shot in golf. And that set off a firestorm that burned almost all of the North American continent to the ground. And with the dust that was thrown into the atmosphere and the nuclear winter that followed, most plant and animal life disappeared from the planet. There are some scientists that speculate that no animal larger than the size of a turkey survived that disaster. But as all disasters on Earth, it opened up new opportunities for life to recover. And in the eons that followed, new forms of life evolved, and oaks first appear in the fossil record during the Eocene period, some 50 million years ago. And if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see a fossilized oak leaf that's 25 million years old. The same era produced a mammal that will eventually stake its future on the newly evolving oak species, the squirrel. That is at least until human beings invent bird feeders, when it'll go in another direction. And although worldwide in distribution, oaks are primarily a North American invention. So there's about 90 species found in the United States and 195 in Mexico, which is the epicenter of oak diversity in the Western Hemisphere. Oaks are wind pollinated with both male and female flowers on the same tree. And the end result of all that self-wooing and reproduction is one of the most characteristic emblems of oakdom, the acorn. And ac is the old English name for oaks. And corn or kern is Greek for kernel. So you have oak corn or oak kernel. And a crop of acorns is often referred to as a mast crop. And you can see from this picture that acorns come in all kinds of styles and colors and shapes and caps. Acorns are favored by many, many kinds of wildlife for food. And it runs the gamut from wild turkeys to tiny weevils that eat the acorns to banded hair streaks that live in the lower branches and on oak bushes. Some species, such as jays, are actually responsible for expanding oak communities because they'll cache acorns in open areas and fields for later use. And of course, some of them never survive to harvest those acorns, and the oaks do a leapfrog from the edge of the forest out into an open area. Mast is also a nutritious food for human beings as well. And there's some new archaeological evidence that suggests that while we domesticated cereal grains about 8 or 10,000 years ago, collection and utilization of acorns stretches back much, much longer and represents probably the first organized attempts by early humans to build a settled culture around a single crop. And what you see in the picture is an interesting archaeological site in Syria, very close to the Turkish border, called Göbekli Tepe. And Göbekli Tepe, it basically means hill in the language of that area, is an enormous temple complex that's 5,000 years older than Stonehenge. And it was built by hunter-gatherers. And there's ample evidence that those hunter-gatherers in that area were depending heavily on acorns for part of their stable crop. So the utilization of acorns for human food goes back a long, long way. Now, on a lighter side, oaks hold really deep cultural meaning for both old and new world cultures. In the British Isles, the oak king battles the holly king twice each year. And when he loses to him, the winter landscape comes on and is ruled by the holly king. And when he bests him in the spring, fertility comes back to the land and the herds. And we're getting ready for the first of these fights. It'll come on the winter solstice, and the oak king will be defeated, and the holly king will rule until spring. Both Native American and European mythologies identify the small people, the fairies, and the elves directly with forest, and in particular with oak groves. And on a full moon night in midsummer, it's still possible to see the fairies as they flit from branch to branch and understand how seeing Luna moths and the silk moths must have first brought such legends into being centuries and centuries ago. The tree spirits that are related to oak groves are called dryads. And legend says that at the birth of a new oak, when the acorn germinates and puts up its first leaves, a new dryad is also born. And that dryad's life is tied forever to the life of the tree. When the tree dies, the dryad dies. And they're very shy and retiring these days, but they still inhabit the oak woods even today. And they disguise themselves during the daylight as trees, only to emerge at night to dance and revel among the oaks. So pay attention when you see an odd-shaped tree out in the woods. And as you return near dusk, make sure that tree's still in the same place you left it. And if it isn't, you know you've seen a dryad. In Northern Europe and in Ireland and Scandinavia, an entire system of writing using representations of various sacred trees, including the oaks, evolved over the past few thousand years, and it's known as ogham. And its writing features a central line that represents the trunk of the tree and horizontal hash marks that are representative of the different branching patterns of different trees. And you can see a stone in Wales that is actually carved in ogham and is about 7,000 or 8,000 years old. What investigation into the oaks would be complete if you didn't mention the Druids? The oak was the principal sacred tree of the Druids, and it symbolized both truth and knowledge. Individual trees could be awakened or brought into consciousness by the careful application of Druidic knowledge, just as they could be put to sleep. And even the word Druid may have its roots in the old Indian or Indo-European word for oak, which is drus or druin. So oak groves were very sacred to the peoples of Northern Europe. Closer to home and closer to ecology, while oaks have a very fascinating cultural history, they possess just as rich an ecological history. And here in the upper Midwest, oak species comprise the foundation of a number of natural community types that we're all very familiar with. How these trees came to be such an integral part of Northern Illinois ecosystems reflects the very dramatic changes to our region that have occurred over the past 100,000 years, but especially over the last 20,000. Recent glaciations pushed the existing natural communities that were in the upper Midwest southward into what are known as continental refugias. These were areas that weren't directly glaciated, usually because they were too high, but they still saw widespread changes to their ecological systems due to the climatic influence of the ice lying in close proximity. So if we look at our oaks, and actually many components of our woodlands, be they oak or otherwise, they sat out that ice sheet further south in the area of the Ozark Plateau and southern Illinois, the southern Illinois highlands. And as the ice sheets began to melt some 20,000 years ago, they began to reinvade, eventually making it into the area south of Lake Michigan. Now, oaks were here all the time, but if you were visiting northeastern Illinois 12,000 years ago, it was a vastly different landscape than we have today. It was full of taiga forest. It was dominated by spruces and pines and firs. It had tundra and it had shrublands. The oaks were present, but they were present on drier sites, and they did not yet compose a major natural community type widespread across the landscape. All that began to change between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago when we entered a period of intense and periodic drought, and that in turn began to breed landscape scale fires across the upper Midwest. And these fires, because of their intensity, selected for open grasslands in areas of gentle topography, and they thinned the existing forest on higher ground. So if you think of a gently rolling landscape, areas that might be very productive cropland right now, the fire is able to move very quickly and very, very intensely across those landscapes. And eventually trees just can't survive there. And the area is converted over time to grassland, to native prairie. When you begin to hit slopes, something different happens. And we'll go into that in a little bit. But those upper areas allowed wooded communities to remain, but it selected for tree species that could handle both drought and periodic fire. And the oaks are champions for those. And they became the dominant wooded species in many Midwestern ecological communities. So if you look across the region, the landscape position and the topography drove both the density and the type of woody plants. So how many trees per acre and what kind was dictated largely by topography. And that topography in turn was related to how fire protected an area might be. So the more fire protected the area, the higher the woody plant density and the less fire sensitive the species composition. This is why typically in our region, when you find natural sugar maple groves, they're usually in protected portions on the east sides of rivers or in areas that are surrounded by wetlands or areas that have very good fire breaks because of the topography. And when you get to areas that are more gently rolling or flat, you find prairie and you begin to find the oak communities that dominate so many places. So the oaks are the product of ice and fire and drought. They are champions at handling all three. So 4 major oak community types occupied much of our landscape on the eve of settlement. So if we run the time clock back to 1830, we're right on the eve of settlement in Northern Illinois. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of them. Now, some of you may be familiar with the terminology and others may be either a little obscure or they may be brand new for you. But the good news is, whether you like lots of oaks or just a few oaks, there's some place where the area you're working in, be it larger or on your own yard, where you can fit in some type of oaks as part of your landscaping or part of your natural community restoration. So the first I'm going to talk about is probably the most poorly understood. And that's the natural community referred to as oak barrens. Barrens occurred in the landscape where the fires were still intense, but they had lost some of their steam because they were moving across rougher topography. And it probably was the most widespread natural community in our region, and it is the rarest one today, even rarer than savanna. What typified the barrens were oak grubs and oak bushes, among other types of shrubs as well. And one of the most common would have been hazelnut, but also dogwoods and sumacs, plums, things today that we may look at in our landscape as being invasive clonal species. But in the original landscape, they were part of this barrens community. And we'll see a little bit later that they all had one strategy in common that allowed them to survive. Note the oak that's multiple trunk there. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. On slightly more protected ground, savanna occurred. And this was characterized by increased sunlight, high shrub densities, and more open grown trees. So in these oak communities, fire intensity was mitigated slightly by the landscape position, but the fire return interval was still pretty frequent. So you had a few widespread open grown trees and a very open grassy understory. If you take a look at the picture on the right, you'll find, and I firmly believe this, that we are by evolution keyed to liking the savanna landscape. This is a recreated savanna landscape that is a human-induced landscape, and the larger trees are there, but it's got a understory of regular lawn and dandelions. But we really like that look. And I think this goes back to being able to see predators in trouble for long distances. And so we're keyed in to the beauty of that landscape because it was the landscape that probably supported us in our very early history as a species. As we move further upslope to where it's even more fire protected, tree densities become higher as well. And so in these areas, we get woodland as opposed to savanna, with more trees per acre, trees that are a little bit straighter grown, more well-developed shrub layers, so lower shrubs, higher shrubs, and some more shade-tolerant plant species. And we actually begin to get some larger diameter trees. I won't get into, in a moment, the actual size of trees in the original landscape, but just for your own guesswork now, think about what the average diameter might have been for an oak in 1835 as the area was being settled. And we'll see that it may be kind of surprising what that actual diameter was. Finally, the most uncommon component of our oak ecosystems in this part of the world was true forest. Oak forest occupied only the most fire protected portions of the landscape. And here you would get multi-layered shrubs and pole trees, and the understory zone would have been developed much better with shade tolerant species. And it would not have burned nearly as frequently as the rest of the landscape. So the oaks were sorted, 1 by topography, 2 by drought, and 3 by fire. But one of the most helpful methods to help us understand oaks and their original place in the landscape as we work to restore them is firsthand accounts. And there, believe it or not, are lots of firsthand accounts beginning on the East Coast all the way to the West Coast that talk about what the landscape looked like as people were beginning to settle it. This one is from a New England prospectus, and it was published in 1634 by William Wood. And he's describing the area around Boston, which we typically wouldn't think of as related to our old communities, but it has a very telling statement in here, which I highlighted. For it being the custom of the Indians to burn the wood in November when the grass is withered and leaves dried, it consumes all the undergrowth and rubbish, which otherwise would overgrow the country, make it impassable, and spoiling their much affected hunting. So that by this means, in those places where the Indians inhabit, there is scarce a brush or bramble. And if you can work your way through the English of that time period, it gives us a really interesting ecological clue. Burning, human-induced burning on the landscape has been part of North America for a very, very long time. By By the early 18th century, the French voyagers were penetrating the upper Midwest on a regular basis in search of furs. And Jesuit priests often accompanied these expeditions, and they were ordered by the Jesuit fathers to write descriptions of the people, of the colonization efforts, of their efforts to convert the native people, and of the landscape in general. So they leave us some really interesting comments about what Northern Illinois looked like. And this is a description by a Jesuit of Northern Illinois sometime in the mid 1700s. The appearance of the country is the most pleasing since we left Canada, being covered with grasses and flowers of a rich and gay hue. The groves are extensive and filled with great herds of conies and stags, and by their appearance look as if apple orchards planted by the hand of God for the pleasure of man's viewing. And you realize the French were very much in love with this landscape. There are even laws that help us understand how common fire was on the landscape. This is part of the Northwest Ordinance. And if you haven't been to school in a long time for history, like I haven't been, there's a map on the right-hand side to remind you of what the Northwest Territory was. It was part of what the country won from Great Britain in the Revolutionary War, and we're certainly part of it. And I won't go into the whole thing, but it's a law that has a preamble that says, whereas there are persons in the habit of setting on fire the leaves and herbage in the woods, prairies, and other grounds, thereby producing a conflagration prejudicial to the soil, destructive to the timber, and improvements within this territory, therefore. And it goes on to explain that if they catch you, you can get so many lashes for lighting a fire, and you can be in big trouble. So you don't enact a law unless something is happening at a common enough rate to make you want to stop it. And this helps us to realize that fire was always an important part of this oak-dominated landscape. As our particular part of the world, Kane, McHenry, Cook, those areas began to get settled, Peck gazetteers were published, and gazetteers were published to help people coming from the east to understand what they were going to need when they got to Illinois. This is from Peck's Gazetteer, and it is typical of such books of the era and talks about the succession of prairie to barrens, giving us a real-time picture of the structure of those early oak barrens. And if you take a look at this and read, the timber is usually scattering of a rough and stunted appearance, interspersed with patches of hazel and brushwood. These barrens occur where the contest between the prairie and the timber is kept up, each striving for mastery. And when the fires are stopped, these barrens produce lumber at a rate at which no northern immigrant can have any just conception. So it goes on to explain almost as though an ecologist were writing this in 1836. So we know the barrens were common enough across our part of the world that settlers needed to be encouraged to understand they would eventually produce timber. There is even firsthand scientific knowledge from the settlement period as well, including some pretty remarkable correspondence between early botanists. George Vasey on the right and Michael Bebb. One lived in McHenry County, that was Vasey. He also worked in Kane County in Elgin. And Michael Bebb lived and worked in Winnebago County during the mid-19th century. And they became very close friends. They exchanged over 300 letters, and they are chock full of botanical information. Vasey arrived in 1849, and he was a young botanist and a young doctor. And he was enamored of the first book on botany that had been created by Asa Gray. And so the enamored young man wrote Dr. Gray a letter and offered to describe the landscape and the plant species on the newly settled northern Illinois McHenry County landscape. And so he wrote a list of prairie and barrens species that he found in the first 2 years of his botanizing. And I want to call your attention to a couple of things. Now, Vasey was from New York, so he was very familiar with forest, very familiar with woods, but he listed only 2 communities as occurring in northern Illinois, prairie and barrens. So if we put ourselves in his eyes, looking at the landscape as a botanist, he doesn't see woods. He does not see forest. He sees only open grassland and small stunted oak trees called barrens. So he listed 118 total species, and only 5 species were listed as being exclusively part of the prairie. 30 were only part of the barrens, and 83 shared both communities. So it's interesting to note when you read these lists, some of the things that he assigned to the barrens and to the prairie. So we can use those kinds of firsthand scientific information along with other written stuff to get a real feel for what this landscape was. We can also look at official government documents, and some of you have heard or are familiar with the public land survey notes, and basically they had to be completed for each county in Illinois prior to being open for settlement, so that when people arrived here, they knew which portion of land they were settling. So it involved putting a square grid on a round landscape. And it also required the surveyor to make important documentation on the nature of the natural communities they were passing through and the condition of the soils. And as it noted, any other remarkable and permanent features of the landscape. So the following information we're about to look at was taken from an analysis of these public land survey notes for the entire Nipperson Creek watershed in McHenry County, tens of thousands of acres. And it is based on all the trees that were marked as witness corners for each square mile section or were encountered along those same lines. Now, I'm not gonna go through a whole bunch of statistics with you, but basically these are the diameter classes of all of the oaks that were used as witness trees during the public land survey. And I will just say to you that over 99% of the trees marked for corners or were encountered along the line were oaks. So the vast majority of trees that were used in the survey as markers were oaks. It tells you a great deal about the structure of those oak communities. You can see that with each species, burr, black, or white, the number of individuals in the diameter class below 20 inches in diameter constitutes anywhere from 70 to 82% of the total witness trees. So basically, we're looking at a landscape where a 12 to 20 inch tree is the most common tree on the landscape. And trees over 20 inches in diameter are very rare, relatively speaking. So we have small, stunted oaks. When we take a look at the undergrowth, because the surveyors were required to note the undergrowth as well, we see some pretty fascinating stuff too. About 50% of the undergrowth descriptions for those tens of thousands of acres have no undergrowth at all. And usually those are the areas that are out in the prairie grasslands. The next most common component that is noted in the undergrowth is hazel. Over 80% of all the understory notes include hazel in some form as a component. And when you add hazel and some combination of oak undergrowth, this would be small oak bushes or oak seedlings, we see that 96% of all those descriptions have either hazel or young oaks or a combination of both. So when we talk about working with oaks, we also need to be talking about working with other types of shrubs that were part of that community as well. So the firsthand accounts and the early data that is available define a very open, very fire adapted oak ecosystem as what existed in our part of the world as settlers began to change that. And while we still utilize fire to manage today's oak ecosystems, the character of those fires have changed dramatically. So historically, those fires were far more likely to have occurred in the fall or late summer. And that makes perfect sense when you think about a landscape that has not had any farm drainage on it and is full of wetlands. Springtime is when those wetlands are full and it's hard for fire to move. Fall is when they're dried up and fire can move freely across the landscape. The fuel matrix has changed. So dead prairie grasses and oak leaves don't make up the main component of the landscape. The main component is European grasses that don't die back until much later in the fall. And the landscape's fragmented, so fire can't move as freely as it did across the landscape originally. And finally, the timber itself has changed in size and has created more shade as a result. So from the abundance of oaks on the landscape, as noted in the public survey notes and in the descriptions, oak reproduction didn't seem to be a problem. But it occurred through two forms. The first form is oaks often germinate in cohorts. So you'll get a bunch of oaks that germinate over a 2 to 3 year period and manage to attain tree size or grub size. And then you may not have another cohort for 20 or 30 or 40 years. So you get this reproduction during prime times and those trees survive. You also, oaks and many of the shrubs have adapted themselves to fire the same way they adapt to grazing. So if a fire knocks out a major oak, that major oak will resprout vigorously from the ground. And you may have an oak that has 3 or 4 stems this size, but might have a plate that's 100 or 200 years old underneath the ground. So it's a good strategy if you're an oak, a hazel, a plum, a sumac, a dogwood. This is how you survive in these types of communities. The resprouting ability also resulted in 2 things that we see very commonly on the landscape today: merged oaks and even age stands. So this is a merged oak. You see a set of 4 oaks on the left that are probably from the same root plate, but they've come up as resprouts and eventually grown into trees because of lack of fire. On the right-hand side, you see a pretty extreme example of what happens over time with merging of different oaks. So you have a large trunk that appears to be one tree, but in fact, it's actually 3 or 4 merged oaks that have come into one. If we travel the landscape today, we often see, especially in rural landscapes where there's still active grazing, we see a lot of even age stands of oaks. And what those date back to is the time fire cessation occurs on the landscape, and those oak grubs in the barrens now can grow up into trees. And they're relatively all the same age. So that is one of the phenomena we see today that actually goes back to the mid-19th century. So the overall distribution, abundance, and the ecological importance of oaks has been altered dramatically since settlement in some fundamental ways. And in 2003, as June alluded to, our agency tried to understand what exactly had happened with the distribution and abundance of oaks from 1837 until 2005. And then we did some more work that took it to 2012. So I'm going to show you some maps. The way we did this is we took those public land survey notes, those are on the left, and that's the grid system that's laid across the landscape. That's in the entire county. So we have written information for all of those lines in regards to the trees that were found on those lines. But how do you fill in each one of those square miles, which is what those squares are? You use the NRCS soil classification system. So soils develop under certain vegetation above them, and they're very slow to reflect change. So we've only settled this part of the world and dug it up and cut it down for less than 200 years. So forest soils still reflect forest. And we're able to use that kind of data to fill in the gaps in between those mile square areas. And when we did that, we found that both sets of data supported one another. So we knew we had a pretty good distribution of where trees were at originally in 1837. Then we're fortunate, both Kane and McHenry County have this same book. It's a combination atlas published in the 1870s. So there hasn't been time for pine stands or maple plantings or buckthorn. And what is reflected in these atlases are where the remaining groves are at in the early 1870s. So we were able to take that information and lay it over the information we had and come up with a layer for where oaks were at in 1872. By 1939, we have real-time air photos. So we're able to take that data through the miracle of GIS and overlay that with the other 2 layers. And indeed, each layer supported the one underneath it. And finally, we were able to take the most recent aerial photography, originally in 2005, but then eventually in 2012, and see where oaks were remaining during that time. So the results were very telling. In 1837, there was about 143,000 acres of oaks in McHenry County. By 1872, that number had dropped to 72,000. And you see the squaring of the landscape as farm fields and pastures are built. By 1939, that number had dropped dramatically to 26,350. And by 2012, it had dropped even more dramatically to around 17,000 some odd acres. By 2012, only 12% of that original oak resource remained. And just between 2005 and 2012, an additional 256 acres of mature oaks had come down. So that's the story. That kind of oak loss is unsustainable, and any unprotected stands could be gone by 2065 at that rate. The good news is we took a deeper look at this and looked at it by size. There were 3,000 oak groves, but only 157 of those were 25 acres in size or larger. So if you look at 25 acres and then you move to 50 on this map set, and then you move from 75 to 100, you see that there were only 8 oak groves of 100 acres in size or larger in 2012. The good news is half of those are in public ownership and are protected or protected privately. So what that resulted in was a much larger regional study sponsored by Chicago Wilderness that eventually grew into the Chicago Wilderness Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan. All northern Illinois counties in the 6-county region have been inventoried, many in Wisconsin, with very similar results. And out of that was born the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan, which has made enormous strides towards protecting mature oaks and replanting young ones. And that is a public-private partnership. And we are actually in what's called Oaktober, which is the month when a lot of replantings go on across the region. So what I would say is if there is a single lesson that can be drawn from that oak study, it's that even the smallest of oak groves matter. It's wonderful to preserve a 100-acre block of woods, but it matters deeply and ecologically to save a 20-acre woods, a 10-acre woods, or the 10 oak trees that are part of your own backyard. All mature oaks matter. So how does that help us to see the forest for the trees a little bit better? So my final thoughts today center on both the responsibility and the possibility that being the owner of one of those few remaining woodlots that have come down to us still intact entails. It also speaks elegantly to the efforts of each individual, and many are in this virtual room tonight, that allow a small piece of wilderness, be that a pollinator garden or the planting of a next century oak, to flourish as part of the place that they call home. And finally, it speaks to a future that is lived in close communion with things wild and free, a future that is unfolding in a dramatic and very positive way each and every day in front of our eyes. Oak ecosystems are more than the sum of their trees, more than the sum of their board feet, of their timber, of their firewood, of their age ratios, and of their harvest plans. They are the sentience of living beings that were born in a planet-wide natural disaster 65 million years ago. They are ancient groves that hundreds of wildlife species depend upon for survival. They are trees that are still alive that felt the weight of passenger pigeons crowding their branches, and they were growing when young men from the farms of northern Illinois were dying in places called Shiloh and Gettysburg. So how do you honor in words a 300 or 400-year-old creature when your experience of existence is lucky to top a century? And I've come to believe that such words are not in the vocabulary of men, but they do exist in the language of trees. If only we had the patience to listen to an ancient language that rises from the very bones of the earth itself, and which we still remember how to speak in the deepest part of our souls. So let us allow the oaks to speak for themselves. Every oak woodland begins at its literal roots, and that includes the soil, the mycorrhizae, the soil invertebrates, the fungi, everything that forms the living skin of that oak community. It is the grasses and the sedges, the lichens and the vines that have evolved to live in the shade and provide the root matrix that holds the soil in a close embrace to the forest floor. Every wood suffers tree throw during a storm, but one that has a healthy ground layer experiences less because it isn't only the roots of the tree holding it in place. It's millions of small roots that are around it that are holding the whole forest floor in place. It is a canvas of wildflowers and ferns that appear in the first warm days of April and continues on until the asters and the goldenrods have had their say in late October. It's water in all of its forms, from the dew that moistens every layer of the woods on one of those misty mornings to the ephemeral ponds that beckon spring peepers and salamanders. Every spring at the same time, the trees are stretching awake from their winter sleep. It's woodland shrubs like blackthorn and arrowwood and hazelnut that grow in the openings and provide nesting habitat for woodland birds. It's understanding that the forest exists not just vertically, but horizontally as well. And each layer supports an intricate web of life. It's the equation of light that allows each one of those layers to flourish. It is understanding the community of trees that compose the forest, not simply the most valuable trees. Understanding that the life of any oak woodland depends on death within that same woodland. Thus, nature attaches just as high a return on a living forest monarch as it does on the decomposing body of that monarch a century later. Board feet is only one measure of a tree's value. A healthy forest has room for trees of all ages and of all conditions. Now, long ago in my first forestry class, I was taught the definition of a forest and I had to learn it for that exam. A forest ecosystem is a dynamic complex of plant, animal, and microorganism communities in their abiotic environment interacting as a functional unit where trees are a key component of the system. How about that for defining a forest? But the forest, and an oak in particular, is more than that. It is a teacher, asking only for us to sit and to mark time as a tree does in order to learn the lessons that it has to impart. And I have been fortunate in my life to have been imparted by oaks many lessons. But I would, if you would indulge me, share 5 of the most important that I believe the trees would like you to know. The first is that all land is sentient. As difficult it was for my ordered and scientific and analytical mind to accept, I've come to realize that I work in a self-aware landscape, a landscape that's awash in sacred places, places that have always been in dialogue with humanity for millennia. Land is a living entity possessed of a knowable energy that can be accessed and understood. This is not a new idea to the West. Once in our Western tradition, these energies were expressed as a numen or a presence, a sort of genus loci or a protective spirit of a place. It was often portrayed as a snake in classical civilization of the Greeks and the Romans. I'm sure each of you have had the opportunity to feel the land you're working with. That is the genus loci of the place that seeps into your being. The entire cosmos is scripture, and the truly wise person kneels at the feet of all creatures. All of creation is possessed of the same shared history, and it stretches backwards into deep time to the very first moment of creation. Therefore, all of life is also sacred. You share an ecological sentience with our planet. And every oak is a sacred text waiting patiently for a reader that will open its pages. Along with big blue stem and murmurations of blackbirds and smooth green snakes, I and you are a chapter in a great story that has unfolded from the first hydrogen atoms to life, to consciousness, and finally on Earth to self-reflective awareness. A gift asks of us a gift in return. The commitment to individual action in the defense of nature is the promise that conservation asks of us from the moment the natural world first allows us inside to see with a deeper clarity. Giving voice to the land is the trade we make for the days we spend in the embrace of the wild. Nature asks of us to use our voice, to tell our stories. And it does not ask of us elaborate sagas. It simply asks us to speak from our heart. Spirit speaks in the voices that are available. The natural world speaks in a language that is all around us, in our own mother tongue. In the morning mist and the evening moonrise, in the rustle of oak leaves, in the January fallen antler. And once we attune to its voice, it can speak in even more direct ways. And if you take a look at this icy river, the Nippersink, on a January day, and you look towards the bottom of the stream, close to the bank, I'm sure you'll clearly see the face of a Native American woman in the swirl that came up from the bottom. Nature is talking all the time. Just have to listen. We're all on the hero's quest, every single one of us. I mentioned to you the event that began the journey for oaks and ended the journey for the dinosaurs earlier this evening. But unlike oaks, we humans are the younger siblings of creation. And now we hold the future of all of creation in our hands. The stakes are very high, the odds are sometimes seeming long, and the duty often sobering in its ramifications. But these are the very components of every quest ever made by every hero. And each person in this room, by the very nature of your commitment to nature, be it on 1,000 acres or in your own front yard, and the work that you have undertaken, each of you deserves the title of hero. Long ago, an older world revealed its wisdom precisely at the moment a young man's dreams threatened to slip away from him. It requested of him a simple reciprocity in return for that wisdom. That world of bur oaks and compass plants, of northward bound cranes and spring wildflowers, asked him to give voice to a world without one. And it is the same question that each of you have answered in the very same way as that young man did 3.5 decades ago. The earth is not without her knights and shield maidens. And today they fill this room. So I will close with a poem. I'll look into a future that I believe to be at our fingertips, a moment of grace that we are already embracing as a culture. It defines how I believe our work shall come to be understood by the greater global culture in the decades to come, long after our atoms, freed from the bounds of human form, and maybe if we are lucky enough and close enough, might merge as one with a nearby oak. I tell you that each of you assembled here today listening define the we few. This story shall the good man teach his sons and daughters from this day on to the ending of the world, of those who step forward to answer the call, to bind up the wounds of a hemorrhaging world. And in such tales, we shall be remembered, we few, we happy few, we band of dreamers. Those who have shed sweat and tears and hope with me shall forever be my brothers and sisters, bound deeper than the ties of kinship. And those now abed, those for whom the gentle earth did not sing an ancient rhyme to, shall think themselves accursed that they were not here, that they did not rise against impossible odds, and hold their humanity cheap while any speak of those that fought with us for river and prairie, savanna and ancient oaks, who sought only the beauty of the wildflowers and song of the meadowlark as payment for that sacrifice. We few, we so fortunate few. Thank you very much. I appreciate your listening to tonight's talk.
Thank you so much, Ed. We're all so thankful that your conservation dreams were realized. And we're really happy and thankful also for the Blue Jay that first communicated with you. That was wonderful.
It was not the best day of my life, I'll put it that way. But it turned out to be pretty good.
We do have some questions for you. Let's see what we have. Oh, actually, an anonymous attendee asked where your poem was from.
I wrote it. If you're familiar with Shakespeare, it's there's a very similar poem, and I think it's in Henry V, but that the concept was there. So I thought about the fact that that is indeed what we're doing over the past 40 or 50 years, is answering the call to a very important thing. So you can credit Shakespeare with the idea.
And Jill goes on to thank you and say how amazing your information has been for us this evening. We also have, let's see if I can get it now. We also have a question in the chat. Oh, yeah, there it is. Gary was talking about the slide that features the glaciation in Illinois, and there is a red plus symbol, and he's wondering what that stood for.
Well, where I got it from was talking about various species of trees and where the refugias were at. And I believe that the person who designed the slide was just identifying the epicenter of that refugia. So I don't believe it has a particular meaning. I think it just identifies a location. Most of our oaks our oak species were in the Ozark Highlands, and those upper areas that are kind of part of the Appalachians plateau that goes further west, and then the Ozark plateau that goes further east. And I would just say that, oaks are a big subject, so please feel free to ask anything you'd like. It doesn't necessarily have to be about the talk, and I'll be happy to try to answer it if I can, or direct you to where some information might be where you can get it.
Great. Joanne wondered, is oak wilt a problem in the country?
Yeah, oak wilt is actually a native disease, so it's always been here. When you have something alive, something else will figure out how to eat it. And there are ways that you can mitigate loss from oak wilt, but they're pretty dramatic, and they involve, often you have to get rid of what's infected, but you also have to break the root bonds between trees. So I would say if you really want good information on oak diseases, the Chicago Botanic Garden and Morton Arboretum have specialists in those kinds of diseases, and that would be my go-to source for that. If you have a tree or two in a stand, especially if they're isolated and they succumb to oak wilt, that process has been going on forever. It's when it runs through a stand and kills most of the trees, that problem is exacerbated by the fact that 250 years ago, it could kill 1,000 acres. That's a drop in the bucket when you have millions of acres of oaks. But today, when we have oak stands that are 5 and 6 acres in size, that's a genuine concern, because that you lose those overstory trees.
Jill was wondering if you've seen the TED Talk about trees, and the scientist, the one that proved that not only do trees communicate with each other, but they also help each other and can identify their own children from the kids of the other trees.
Yeah, I have seen it, and it's fascinating. And there are also some folks who have worked with sophisticated technology, which is far beyond, I am a Luddite, and it is far beyond me. But they have managed to produce musical notes from some of the signals that trees give, and have literally translated that into music. And they've done it with other plants as well. And there is also I believe it's called the bloop, but it's the noise that Earth makes just as a planet. So, when I say to you, the ground's talking, I'm not trying to be particularly odd about that. It's just, we live very busy lives, and just the opportunity to stop and sit in one place for a while. There's nothing unusual, I think, about a person hearing that. It's just really having the time to attune yourself. So yeah, I have seen it, and I would recommend, well, first of all, TED Talks are great anyway, but if you haven't, look that one up. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
Ed, Nancy was wondering if it's possible to obtain a copy of your poem.
Yeah, certainly. I'll be happy to send along. You can share it with whoever you'd like.
Thank you so much. I think there's another, there might be another question. Yes, Leland wondered what actions can ordinary employed people take to support the idea that Oak Lives Matter?
Wow, that's a great question, and I would say in a couple of ways. I think it starts first with an individual taking the time, and sometimes we think this is a luxury, but attuning ourselves to the oaks that are around us and enjoying them and coming to learn from them. Sometimes I'm asked to take a look at a piece of property, which I love to do, and folks will say, well, okay, well, what do I do with management? What's my first step? And there's a lot of stuff you can do for first steps. You can clear brush, or you can remove invasives, or you can put seed down. You can do a whole bunch of stuff. But my first advice to them is always the same. Pick a really nice day. If it's a light drizzle, that's fine too. But pick a day that appeals to you and go out into your woods and walk around in it. And when I say woods, I live on 5 acres. So I don't live in a very gigantic oak forest anywhere. 5 acres is pretty big. Go out into your place, wherever it may be, and walk around till you find out where the heart of that place is. And you'll just know you're in the right place. And that's where I would start my management from. And then there are wonderful books about all the stuff you need to do to manage oak woods. And, we could spend hours on that. But once you have kind of attuned yourself to the environment around you, there are a lot of places where you can get involved, and they range from not wanting to be involved politically or at meetings or things like that to, where you just go out and work on land, to actually being, an advocate for change. And I don't think it matters what you do so much as you bring your honest self to it. Now, if you're a person that doesn't like to talk in crowds, then don't be a person that talks in crowds. But like I said, bring your own story to it. There is an old saying that what is said by the heart is heard by the heart. And I will, if we have, I don't know how time is, but I have a very brief story that maybe some of you have heard, maybe some of you haven't. But a number of years ago, a pipeline company was coming through one of our sites, and they already owned the pipeline, so there wasn't much we could do about it. But they wanted to expand one more piece of pipe in the existing footprint, and they came to us and said, we need to take out a bunch of oak trees for a working easement to turn equipment around. And these were big trees. There was 126 of them, and some of them were 300-400 years old. And we tried everything, to get them not to do that. And it didn't work. And it came down to a phone call at the end where they basically had made up their mind they were going to take the trees out because they could. And if you know what a Hail Mary pass is, you kind of throw it at the last instant, hoping somebody downfield will catch it. Just before we got off the phone, one of the lawyers for the company said, well, is there anything else? And I said, yeah, those trees were growing. And that line I told you about, when young men were marching off to be killed at Gettysburg and Shiloh, those trees were growing when that happened, and you want to cut them down so you can turn a backhoe around easier. And there was a long quiet, and then they said, well, what do you want us to do? And we lost 26 trees, not 126 trees. And the company bought an 80-acre-old woodland that joined the site. So I will say to this day, the reason that didn't turn out the way it looked like it would turn out is speaking from the heart to somebody who heard it from the heart. So whoever's question it was, that would be my recommendation to you. Every person in this room is in love with nature in their own way, or you wouldn't be here tonight learning about oaks and learning about how to do things on your own land. Tell your own story and tell it in your own words. And that has an amazing impact on other people. I think as humans, we long for that kind of honest dialogue, and we're receptive to it. So that's about the best advice I can give.
Oh, thank you. Leland also asked if he could have a transcript of this. He calls it a scientific religious talk.
Oh.
And we're actually recording this to put on our site. So maybe that would suffice for Leland.
Yeah, I'm happy to send you a transcript. I am not one of those people who remembers things well. So I typically write down what I'm going to say so that I don't panic at the last minute and go, what was I going to talk about?
Oh,
So yeah,
great.
I'll be happy to send it along to you.
Oh, thank you. Leland, if you want to put your contact in the chat, we'll get it before we close tonight. And let's see, Jill has written one more comment that's delightful. I have long felt that trees have a consciousness. So thank you for that confirmation. I do think there is a reason various stories like the Ents and the Lord of Rings came about, which is delightful.
Yeah.
That's all we have.
It's a slow magic if you're going to work with trees. They are not in a hurry.
That's all we have for you tonight, Ed, but
Okay.
you gave us so much, and thank you for your stories. They were wonderful. Thank you so much for honoring wild ones tonight, and thank you all for coming to this wonderful program and presentation.
My
Have a good
pleasure.
evening.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Have a good evening. Good night.